Israel who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob in it. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. But Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. The children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join with our enemies and fight against us. So go up out of the land, and so go up out of the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. They built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. So they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with vigor, made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick and all manner of service in the field, and all their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shipra and the other was Puah. And he said, "When you do the duty of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see him on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Would you say those words after me, please? The more they afflicted them,
the more they afflicted
the more they
them,
multiplied,
the more they multiplied,
and the
more they grew.
Greater blessings
Greater blessings
for greater affliction.
for greater
Would
affliction.
you say those words after me, please? Greater blessings
Greater blessings
for greater affliction.
for greater afflictions.
The text says that Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. I wonder if they remember some statistics that I read years ago. Those statistics indicated that only 8 out of 100 people will live to be 70 years old. Only 2 out of 100 people will live to be 80 years old. And only about 1 out of 100 will live to be 90 years old. I received an email a few days ago informing me that the oldest preacher in the Church of God in Christ had recently died. He was born around 1903 and lived to be 109 years old. His name was Elder Otis Granville Clark. He lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. 99% of people pass away without ever coming near to the age of 109. So tonight we honor the memory of Elder Otis Granville Clark. We also honor the memory of Pastor Grover, who was chairman of the Council of Pastors and Elders. He passed last week at the age of 86 years old. Since my childhood, I've seen 3 generations of leaders passed off the scene. That indicates to me that we would do well to think more in generational terms, and to understand that there will come a time when each and every generation will pass away. Today's generation of leaders must prepare and make room for the next generation of leaders. And as we grow older, we must think less of ourselves and more about those who will follow us. Every generation comes to a point when all that generation will be gone. Joseph died, and his brothers, and all that generation. Acts 13:36 says in reference to David, "For David, after he had served his own generation by the will of God, fell asleep and was buried with his fathers." And so every generation must spend much energy planning and working for the good and the advancement of the next generation. And following generations should be careful to work, to build on the work of preceding generations. It's tragic when it is the next generation either ignores the work of its predecessor or is incapable of continuing that work or so squanders that work that all is lost. But though that entire generation passed away, God's providential involvement with his people Israel did not stop with the death of Joseph, and it did not stop with the demise of that generation. As a matter of fact, the Bible tells us that they grew even in the absence of any leader that we know about. They were increased from 70 souls in verse 5 to 600,000 men on foot by the time of the Exodus, which may have meant that from 2.6 to 8 million people, when counting all the families and relatives of these 600,000 men and the mixed multitude that followed them, they may have represented as much as 1/3 of the population of Egypt. God has long before promised Abraham that he would make of him a great nation, and after 400 years he would deliver Israel from captivity in Egypt. But several years after the death of Joseph, a new king of Egypt took control of the throne. This man knew little about Joseph, if anything, and he knew little about the history of the nation over which he had taken control. If this king had remembered Joseph, or he had cared enough to consult the history of his people, he would have noticed the positive impact that Joseph and the Israelites had on the destiny of Egypt. He would have remembered how Joseph had prophesied that there was going to be a devastating famine. And Joseph had provided the strategy that not only saved all of Egypt, but saved thousands and even millions in the surrounding area and enriched the royal family beyond all imagination. If that king had known history, he would have known or remembered that Joseph had ascended to the vice presidency of the land of Egypt on the wings of a series of afflictions that his enemies had imposed upon him. Joseph's own brothers had thrown him into a pit, intending to let him die. And then they decided to sell him into slavery, so they took him out of the pit and sold him. His slave master who bought him committed him to prison based on a lie. And the invaluable years of his life had been spent in prison, and in first one adversity and then another adversity. But after all Joseph went through, Joseph was able to say to those very brothers who sold him into slavery in the first place, "But as for you, you meant evil against me.
All right.
But God meant it for good."
Yes.
And I want to bring about as it is this day to save many people alive. And then Joseph said, "Now therefore don't be afraid. I'll provide for you and your little ones." He spoke kindly to them and comforted them. And then in Genesis 41 and 50, when Joseph had his second son, he named that son Ephraim. And he said, I'm calling him Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And so Joseph and Israel had had a good impact on the land of Egypt. A positive and productive relationship had developed between the Israelites and the Egyptians, and Pharaoh should have attempted to build on that good relationship by kindness. But instead of seeking to further build a positive relationship with Israel, he demonized them. And he contrived a plot to destroy them, to break their spirits, to stop them from reproducing, and to cause them to so despair of life that they would die emotionally and ultimately die physically. Israel might not have been a threat to Egypt. Every successful or powerful person is not a threat to you. There are at least two sources of this unfounded, paranoid fear of those who seem to be destined for significance. The first source of this fear is the attribution to the other individual or individuals of feelings or attitudes that one himself would have were he in their position. If I was in that position, I would feel something so I assume that everybody else who is in that position will feel the same way I would have done. And according to some historians, this is exactly what the Pharaoh did. He and his kinsmen were not native-born Egyptians. They were foreigners who had by force conquered Egypt and had taken the throne, and thus he calculated that the Israelites would do the same thing if they had an opportunity. Could somebody say praise the Lord?
Praise the Lord.
He projected on Israel the inclination that had characterized his own mind. And that is the tendency or desire to conquer. And then he acted on his projections without reason and without foundation. But then secondly, insecurity may cause you to feel that others will take advantage of your plight.
All right.
And so the Pharaoh acted toward them with a preemptive hostility when there was no real reason for him to do so. All they were doing was going about their business and doing their work. But he was so insecure when he saw their strength, he became afraid, and he decided that I better preempt what I think they may want to do to me. And if you feel that there's a limited amount of money, limited amount of power, limited amount of success from which if other people withdraw, then you feel that you will be limited in your capacity to withdraw. If you feel that the blessings that God sends into the lives of other people will constitute blessings that will not and cannot come into your life, then you will feel that you've got to stop them so that there will be more for you.
All right.
But listen, trying to block somebody else does not mean that you will increase your share.
That's right.
Would you please look over at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, trying to block somebody else
Trying to block somebody
does
else
not mean that you will increase your share.
does not mean that you will
If
increase
Pharaoh
your
could
share.
testify on tonight, he would tell you that you can lose everything you've got trying to keep somebody else from getting what God has in store for them.
Yes.
Listen, you better bless the folk around you.
Yes.
You better love the folk who are around you. You better encourage the people who are around you. You better trust God, and God will bring His purpose for you to pass.